You're listening to Live Free, Think Free on 90.1 KPFT Houston, your home for uncensored news and underground music since 2011.
Since 2011, Derrick and I have been going at this show, doing news analysis, talking about freedom, talking about what's going on, taking your comments, taking your suggestions, having guests. We brought Johnny on board, like 4 years ago now, something like that. He'll be back next week. That's exciting. He's married now. All kinds of things going on. So we're glad to be on KPFT yet again. Thank you, everyone tuning in everywhere. I know we're all over the place out there on Spotify. Those who follow appreciate that. There, huge platform. Always trying to reach people with the message.
You can find us at thehoustonfreethinkers.com, of course. And as Micah said, we can find Live Free, Think Free, our show title, on Spotify and all the good places. Again, our website, thehoustonfreethinkers.com. You can find all the archives. I've been slacking a little bit on getting the archives, so I just fixed it all up. And we missed the show last week. I was in Houston seeing family and saw Micah, saw Johnny for his wedding, but we didn't get to do a show. So we're back at it. But if you've seen our recent shows and you want to check out the archives and some of the stories we've covered, it's all there now. Everything's caught up. And you can search Live Free, Think Free on Spotify and other streaming platforms. You can also go find us at theconsciousresistance.com. You can see the Live Free, Think Free archives there. Right now, we're live on Facebook, YouTube, Odyssey, and Rockfin, all under The Conscious Resistance. My other accounts, including our typical Live Free, Think Free account, I'm currently locked out of streaming for the moment. So we're streaming where we can, and we're appreciating all of you who are tuning in tonight. Yeah, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. A lot of good stuff. Weather's cooling down in Houston. Like both of us enjoyed being out at the park just last weekend, and I think that's good. I know there's a lot of news for us to get into, and music as always. I want to let everybody know we appreciate your comments. So if you got something to add, I know you probably saw that one there that I've got about how the Houston prosecutors are keeping cash, and I know you said you had another one you wanted to jump in. Unless you want to jump in that one first, I say
let me go ahead and let me get into this one story. I want to start off with the Houston. I know you got the couple you want to get into. This one is a Houston-related story. It happened in Houston while I was in Houston, and that is that last week, on the day we typically do the show, I went to the Houston World Affairs Council event, which is a local organization. They have chapters all over the U.S., and pretty much they promote neoconservatives in the military-industrial complex. They had John Brennan, who is former CIA director, longtime spook, 25 plus years in the CIA and other intelligence agencies. And he was there with another CIA operative talking shop and getting praise. And it was really sick, honestly, man. There was like a little bit of recruiting high school kids going on. He was claiming, the CIA is known for being not very diverse and full of old white men and things like this. But we care about diversity and LGBTQ because, honestly, the more languages you speak, the better of a spy you are. This is literally what he said to, it was mainly adults, but there was definitely, I'd say 20 to 30 high school kids that were brought there. And I doubt they were just, run-of-the-mill kids. They were probably some of the best and brightest being brought there. And he specifically said, we're hiring for 17 different positions. You can go to CIA.gov and this and that. And meanwhile, like bigger topics like John Brennan's role in the U.S. torture program, John Brennan's role in surveillance and the drone program under the Obama administration and torture in the Bush administration. These things were pretty much being ignored and not even really discussed or up for discussion. And as you've been to these kind of events, we've been there together, Micah, these types of things. It's not the sort of thing where you're going to get a real genuine, deep question asked. And knowing that, I figured okay, I'm going to go here and I'm going to see what I can do. And that's what I was able to do. I'm going to play a clip now from this video. It's the actual interaction between me and John Brennan, which I was able to get, was only about a minute and a half at most.
This is Derrick, Broze.
So let me go ahead and skip ahead here. Like I said, I basically went to this event. You can see here, World Affairs Council. And this is some of the pictures. Let me go back a little bit. You can see some of the people gathered, getting selfies from him. So it was just a big love fest from him. Kids, high school kids, old folks, all lining up to get selfies from him. And this is the part of the video where I walk up to John Brennan as he is walking to the elevator. So check this out. We'll be right back.
bilingual people to be spies and things like this. Anyways, I lasted as long as I could, and by the end of the event, I decided to ask him questions directly to his face. So check out that right now.
How do you respond to the claims that your decision of the Bush and Obama administrations led to unnecessary torture? You addressed in there, what you said was necessary, and you said you'll strive not to have any civilian deaths, but the documents leaked by Snowden show a whole other story, show the disposition matrix was not as accurate as you represented it, sir. How would you respond to the critics of you lying about surveillance, saying that there was no mass surveillance of Americans? That's on the record. And originally people didn't want you in the Obama administration because your ties to torture under the Bush administration. Now you've rehabilitated your character and become a hero to the left because of your anti-Trumpness. But what do you say to the critics who still care about America not being the police of the world and not doing rendition and torture and kidnapping of Americans? What about the people who've had to sue the U.S. government because they've been tortured? The people who have permanent rectal damage because of the torture that you approved? The people who have permanent shoulder damage because they've been tortured by the U.S. government under your decisions?
I would say get your facts right, because all your facts you've said right now are wrong.
No, they're not. The lawsuits are there. The individuals who were illegally detained under your approval under rendition programs after 9/11 are successfully suing the U.S. government. Thousands of people were illegally kidnapped because of your decisions. You're talking about torture. You lied about mass surveillance of Americans. That was all shown to be public now. I'm just saying facts.
Students of peace. This is a student affair.
Well, the students are being indoctrinated to support a war criminal. You're a war criminal, Brennan. You're a war criminal. And the students need to know that. You approve torture, mass surveillance of Americans, and he continues to spread propaganda. This is the head of the CIA, and you guys are teaching the kids to worship him. The agency responsible for overthrowing governments. He himself supported torture. He also promoted mass surveillance of Americans. Well, because I'm trying to hold the U.S. accountable, I should go elsewhere. These are all I'm saying. These are facts under his watch.
And there you go. It goes on for another minute or so. I don't know if you guys could hear clearly at the end. That gentleman told me, if you don't like it, go to Moscow. If you don't like it, go.
That was particularly distasteful because I think a lot of us would associate some of the sort of behavior with, more of a totalitarian regime than we would expect from the United States. So hearing your complaints about totalitarian, authoritarian moves of torture and deception, your questions about them, and having someone respond that, oh, you question that? Go to Moscow then. Whoa, wait a minute. So you think that it's going to be like less authoritarian in Moscow? I mean,
yeah,
you get what I'm saying here? I mean, it's just like this is the topsy-turvy clown world we live in. Where you say this and you get that sort of like response from someone there, and he's stuck on it, right? He's a repeater. He says it 3 times.
Yeah, no, exactly. And after that, like it continued for a moment. It was interesting. I don't think I even caught this on tape. I think I ended the recording. But that gentleman who was going back and forth, after we went back and forth for a couple more minutes and he actually heard me, it's like he calmed down and then really heard what I said. And he was like, okay, you're right. Like what it came down to was he started talking about terrorism. And I was like, come on, man, those programs, there's no evidence to show that torture has led to actionable evidence. This is something the U.S. government has admitted, despite what they claimed about Osama bin Laden's death years ago. And the guy kind of paused and he's like, you're right. And I was like, it's all security theater, man. So why, are you sitting here praising this guy who's approving of these kind of decisions when it hasn't led to, at least as far as we know, any sort of good. And it definitely hasn't helped America's moral standing in the world or anything like that. But yeah, and then I'm just showing on screen for those who are watching. This is at thelastamericanvagabond.com. I wrote this piece just kind of summarizing how and why I did this. It's just called I Confronted Former CI Director John Brennan. Here's why. And it goes into the different things. I mean, going back to 2012, you can find articles even before then, but I found some interesting ones written by Glenn Greenwald. And I thought was interesting about this, Micah, is it's from 2013, and it's an opinion piece published by Greenwald for the New York Times. And here we are 10 years later, and this would never happen. For one, now they consider Glenn Greenwald, they call him some far right, whatever. He has to go on Fox News to be heard. But at this time, the New York Times was still talking about this, and he just does a pretty good job outlining how it's Obama really played a big role, because when he came into office, he told everybody, we don't need to prosecute the Bush administration and all the torture and the things they were up to after 9/11. We need to look forward, not backwards. And Glenn Greenwald talks about how this basically set the stage for accepting these kinds of controversies, and now they're not really seeing that as that much being that controversial anymore. And I think that's definitely true where we're at now, even more so than when he wrote this a decade ago. And then he goes into just showing how Brennan's pro-torture and rendition is the word they use for kidnapping people that they say are suspected of terrorism, taking them to random black sites, hidden prisons around the world, and doing whatever they want with them. It says as early as 2007, the New Yorker described Brennan as the CIA's interrogation, the supporter and the architect of CIA's interrogation and detention program. All the way back in 2005, on NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, Brennan admitted that he was, quote, intimately familiar now over the past decade with cases of rendition. And again, that's going back, he said that in 2005, that for a decade, which would be 1995, he was already familiar with cases of rendition. So that's even before 9/11, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I just go in here and showing some of the different decisions. Brennan was also seen as the main architect, the chief architect of Obama's drone program, specifically what they call the disposition matrix, otherwise known as the presidential kill list. You can find articles where CNN calls him Obama's drone warrior. The Washington Post saying that, he's the principal architect of a policy that has transformed counterterrorism from a conventional fight centered in Afghanistan to a high-tech global effort to track down and eliminate perceived enemies one by one. And he's even at one point said that he thinks that drones could be used on American soil because that the battlefield of the war on terror is basically unlimited. They can go wherever they want and do whatever they want. There's also some other things about suspicions of him potentially having something, who knows what, to do with the death of journalist Michael Hastings, who had done some really great work back in 2012, 2013, was writing for Rolling Stone, and he had exposed, kind of embarrassed one of the generals who got fired by Obama, and then he publicly announced that he was working on an article about John Brennan, and he died in a single car accident in LA at 4 a.m. The video of it shows his car racing down the street, at an insanely fast speed, crashing into a tree and then exploding. And shortly after that, WikiLeaks reminded the world that they had leaked files, including the Vault 7 files from the CIA, showing that the CIA had capabilities of that. I'm not saying John Brennan killed Michael Hastings, but he sure had some sort of sour relationship with him. So I put it all in an article in case anyone wants to see, or hear the facts behind why I chose to do something like that. And I did want to say real quick, let me show this, Micah. This isn't the first time we've done this. In fact, we've done this together with previous war criminal. So I'm going to treat you guys to a flashback video here. It's only 4 minutes long. Check this out. This is Micah, myself, and the Houston Freethinkers confronting Henry Kissinger back in 2014, I think, 2013, somewhere around then. It's coming. Here goes the intro. Should be, maybe there's no sound. Are you hearing any sound, Micah? I'm not getting sound.
I'm not hearing the sound.
Okay, it looks like it downloaded without sound. Yeah, so I'll narrate this a little bit. It'll skip forward, but you can find this if you're on YouTube. Go search the Houston Freethinkers. You can find our old YouTube channel. You can find this video. This was, as I said, 2013. Look at me looking a little bit younger there. We found out that Henry Kissinger was coming to Houston, and we, similarly to what I did with Brennan, we organized. And this time we actually were able to get a group of people there, and we kind of staked out the whole building, surrounded it with, the corners, kind of keeping an eye on for a couple hours until Henry Kissinger showed up. And of course, the interaction, as these things typically are, was very brief, but we at least slowed them down, I think, and caused a little stink in their day, to say the least. So, that was something that I was. We were able to do something like that. Here it is. So Henry Kissinger pulls up. I'm yelling at him about Operation Condor, and this guy's a war criminal. There you can see him sitting in the back seat. Micah's there. You can see some other Houston Freethinkers filming, and so a couple people were with us. We're pretty angry and yelling all kinds of things, which I can understand. I'm sitting here yelling to this cop like, "Hey, this guy's a war criminal, and you're protecting him." And one of the cops seemed kind of interested. He's like, "Well, we can't do anything about that. We're local cops." And he seemed like at least curious as to what the heck we were yelling about, right? Usually, and as you can see here, these are the people escorting Kissinger out of the car into the building. And there's a point here where you can see the people sort of laughing at us, looking at us like we're insane because we dare. I mean, obviously we're yelling, being loud, but we're questioning the man that they're all about to go inside the building and celebrate. This was the Asia Society of Texas honoring Henry Kissinger for his accomplishments in diplomacy and Vietnam and things like that. So yeah, so we've been doing that sort of thing for a while, and I encourage you, anybody out there who feels inclined to something like that, to go out there and try to find out. I said this in a video I did the other day, but the way I found out about this, I follow groups like the World Affairs Council. All I did was subscribe to their email list. They send out emails every month telling you when Peter Hotez is going to speak, or when John Brennan's coming to town, or Bush administration officials. Sign up to your local mayor press release, your local police press releases, because you find out a lot of useful information, especially if you're curious and interested in asking your local, political positions, local power questions. It's a good idea to know where they're at and when they're going to be certain places.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate and support everybody that does that. I know I've seen some amazing work done out there, and I could say some names, but I don't think it really matters, because it's, the nameless individual that gets out there and, makes a name for themselves, or else gets out there and, asks those important questions that then has a video that, documents, one of these authoritarians or one of these people that's worth asking questions to, some real hardball journalist type questions, and I do think it takes a lot of character to do that when you don't already work for one of these magazines like we're looking at here or something, because you have to keep your cool, and you're often talking to someone who's surrounded by a lot of armed protection. And I would say for a reason, good or bad, they are surrounded by them for a reason, because a lot of people have questions to ask them. And, if you're able to, I would look at that as a great responsibility, and so having it together, to ask the question, having it together to get a response, because there's been times I've seen where you're able to get a response from some people that the response is fairly interesting. And that's always, the treasured part there. That's what turns it into an interview.
Yeah, and that's definitely my goal. I'll just make that clear to anybody. My goal is always like, can I get an actual, like, is this person going to answer any of my questions for a couple minutes?
And this differentiates the person who does this from the person who goes there and screams and just videos it.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. I didn't want to just do that route. Like I try to assess the situation. There's 250 people like kind of sycophants for this man. I could be attacked if I tried to, like, hey, John Brennan in the middle of everybody.
Yeah, they won't understand you. It's too loud. It's too offensive.
I just would get kicked out before I could do anything anyways, right? And then the other thing is
those words.
The place, they weren't letting people ask questions. So it was like, write your question on a card, and then they pick which questions they want to ask, right?
Yeah.
So I've been there before. They never let any. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get a question to the crowd, like in front of everybody. I could go just nuts in front of everybody if I wanted, but I just decided to be patient and wait. And once I saw that he was doing the selfies and hanging out, I was like, okay, I'm going to be able to get him like on the way out. And I just timed it right. I saw, and there was honestly, which is interesting, for maybe he feels this confident, for the former head of the CIA, he had only one local cop like with him there. And thankfully, the cop didn't put his hands on me. So when I kind of beelined towards him and walked with him in the elevator, the cop was trying to stay between us a little bit, but nobody ever put their hands on me, thankfully. So yeah, sometimes you can get like a real sit down. It might not be friendly interview, and other times you're just not going to get that. So for me, it's worth to like, hey, I'm going to just ask him questions that he will probably never be asked, on MS. He definitely won't be asked this on MSNBC or CNN and all the places that he's now a media consultant. And those people, as we've seen before, Micah, even the local mayors and stuff, they put themselves in bubbles, and they're not used to people showing up and asking a question that they're not expecting. And I think that's where it's like the illusion is shattered for a moment. People are like, oh my God, John Brennan looking nervous. Like he can't get away from somebody asking him a question. That's not the usual position, or posture we see him. So I think that's important on that level as well. But I want to mention we got some viewers over on Odyssey. Shout out to everybody watching over there. We appreciate you guys. Give us a flame up. We have flames and splats on Odyssey. So give us a flame up or a thumbs up if you're over on Rockfin, where we got thumbs. And appreciate both you everybody watching on Odyssey and Rockfin, and everybody who is watching on the Conscious Resistance Facebook and or YouTube. Let's go ahead and get to this next story, Micah. Did you want to start with this one?
Yeah, no doubt. Let's get in on it. I do think that it's great to talk to, and that was one of the fun things with the Free Thinkers, was all the different people out there, gathering bits of journalistic intel and just doing that sort of work. And every time I think it's just like going, practicing. Every time you just get better and better. So yeah, let's get into this. This is a case that we know very well, believe it or not. It's and here we've made, national media again, Houston Houston prosecutors are keeping cash seized from defendants whose cases were compromised by police corruption. Okay, corruption, case compromised, keep cash. Okay, I guess I don't see how that's news. We know what's going on, but let's figure out more about how it's going on. In response to the scandal that engulfed the HPD's narcotic division after the 2019 drug raid based on falsified search warrant, you know which one, Harris County prosecutors dropped dozens of pending cases and recommended the reversal of at least 5 convictions. I mean, think about that. 5 convictions. And if they had been able to, just gloss it over and have everybody stop asking questions or digging into it, maybe that wouldn't have happened. They said those cases were irredeemably tainted by the involvement of Gerald Goins, the officer who lied to obtain a 2019 warrant that led to the deaths of Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nichols, or similarly dishonest colleagues. But that judgment did not necessarily mean that the defendants recovered cash or cars seized by Houston's corrupt cops under the pretext of enforcing drug laws. Even in cases that hinged on the trustworthiness of demonstrably untrustworthy cops, the Houston Chronicle reports, prosecutors so far have chosen to keep nearly all of the property seized from defendants. That striking contradiction illustrates the lax rules governing civil asset forfeiture, which allows prosecutors to pad their budgets by confiscating allegedly crime-tainted property. The Chronicle identified 36 instances in recent years where an indicted member of Squad 15 narcotics unit swore to the facts used to justify a search leading to cash or vehicle confiscation. Like maybe they like a car, The loot collected over a 5-year period included about $75K in cash and several cars. Records show some or all of the money confiscated during the bust was returned in 5 cases, the Chronicle reports, typically after defendants hired lawyers to challenge the forfeitures. But the county has kept the rest of the money in the cars, even though prosecutors consider the evidence that led to seizures unreliable because it was offered by cops with a record of making stuff up. Imagine that.
I think it's just so crazy, man. Like, because we've been covering this for those who followed us for a while. If you followed this story in Houston, unfortunately, there's a bunch of them, so it might have slipped through your mind. But what is it called?
It's 2 stories we've covered for a while. Civil asset.
They're both overlapping. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this situation though is like corrupt. This is like that movie Training Day, corrupt, dirty cops to the max. Like in Houston, you got this elite squad unit ripping people off, doing all kinds of crazy things. And then they do no-knock raids. Some people get killed. We find out there's a bunch of lies. I mean, it's just been digging deeper and deeper over the years. And I definitely, like you were saying earlier, like if people like us and others in Houston who stayed on the story, and of course the family themselves, hadn't even talked about the Tuttles case and other similar cases like that, and you got other stories in other cities, then I don't know if this would still be being discussed. It probably would have just moved on, and they would have said, oh yeah, some crazy people shot at the cops and they had to kill them, poor, sad thing, but that's what happens, right? But it was only because people were persistent in going after the truth that anything came out to find out, that we came to find out that there was all these layers of lies and all this layer of corruption going on.
Undoubtedly. But yeah, the story goes on. It details a few of the individual cases where people got their money back, where other times, also just a little bit more of the corruption. And it goes on to inform us that the Texas Supreme Court underlined a distinction in 2016 when it concluded that the exclusionary rule, which bars admission of illegally obtained evidence, does not apply to civil actions. Basically when you sue someone for the civil damages, like as opposed to a criminal case. A state law authorizing forfeiture contraband. The case involved the seizure of a 2004 Lincoln Navigator from Miguel Herrera, who was arrested after police found drugs in the car. Herrera argued that the search was unconstitutional because the cops did not have reasonable suspicion to pull him over, and the drugs that they found should not be considered as evidence to support the forfeiture of the car. Basically, they're like, whoa, and the trial courts and the appeals courts agreed, but the Supreme Court did not, saying an illegal seizure of evidence does not require exclusion in a Chapter 59 civil forfeiture proceeding. That means drugs discovered during an illegal search based on Goins' lies, even although not admissible in any criminal case, could still be used to justify grabbing the cash and cars and other things, assuming the owner challenged the forfeiture. Yep.
Yeah, asset forfeiture is one of these really messed up things that just it's like it's obviously it's a problem. A lot of people from different political sides can agree about it, but it's something that continues. And there's been a few places in the US and elsewhere who've tried to put an end to it or have put an end to it, but it still happens all over the place. And this is just nuts. I'm glad you're covering this story.
Speaking about it going on all over the place, the next paragraph tells us about $42,300 that a couple got taken away from just because they were following too closely. Yeah. So, I mean,
I believe it.
They're looking for money. And this is a long article, and it'll be up there on the Houston Free Thinkers along with the others. If you haven't heard of civil asset,
go check it out.
Yeah.
Go check it out, guys. It'll be at the HoustonFreeThinkers.com. We got some more news coming up. We got a couple more Houston stories. And then we got, between me and you, Micah, a couple of health stories, an update on the fluoride lawsuit. I got this one I want to cover in just a bit about Canada getting closer to letting people die, it's euthanasia if they have mental illness. We're going to get into all that and more, but we've been at this for 25 minutes, and I think it's time for a music break. What do you think, Micah? Should we just hit a quick song, come back?
Music!
All right, let's do it. We'll be right back. You're listening to Live Free, Think Free. This is Heavy Thoughts from Houston, Texas. Stay tuned.
Sinking, climbing, some things aren't for everyone. I've seen some things that could take a father from his son. We should. Some people are better off alone. Are we really all alone? I've gone too hard, been drinking every night alone. Cigarettes and broken home. Fight for rights that make you stand to your feet. We are living in an age of killer streets. Run for a safer place we all can call a home. Every one of us should have known. I've been drinking every night alone. Cigarettes and broken home. Are some things I shouldn't that I know. But you've been places I would never go. When somebody freaks out and nothing becomes clear, you wanna just peel out and get away from here. But I've been afraid of losing a friend and changing my life all over again. Flown to hope. Flown to hope. Well, I've been drinking every night alone. Cigarettes and broken home. Are some things I shouldn't that I know. But you've been places I would never go. I've been drinking every night alone. Cigarettes and broken homes. Had some things I shouldn't that I know. But you've been places I would never go. Places I would never go.
All right, welcome back to Live Free, Think Free. We do this every week on the Conscious Resistance and 90.1 KPFT in Houston. That was Houston's own Heavy Thoughts. We're always looking for new music. In fact, probably need some new music. It's like Thanksgiving, holiday time, and we've got a lot of music here, but we've played a lot of it a lot. So if you got some suggestions, reach out to Micah. What's the email, Micah? Visionarynoise@gmail.com.
That'll be a good one. Yep. Visionary Noise at Gmail. Reach out to any of us at our pages or just send us what you got. If you're dropping something soon or you've got a friend that you noticed help us keep the good music playing. And I do think it's kind of interesting because, we used to constantly bring in new songs just ferociously. But I think by playing some of the songs more often, maybe our audience starts to recognize some of them and like them. I don't know. So that makes me feel kind of good, that aspect of it. But yeah, let's keep going with the news. I mean, it never ends. It never ends. I mean, we have to be pretty selective. Thank you, everybody who supports us and goes to kpft.org and donates in the name of Live Free, Think Free. We definitely want to support the station. We're happy to be there, and we want to, I guess, expand the opportunities for our audience to enjoy listening to us there and be engaged with our show there. So we'll talk more about that as it goes on. But yeah, it turns out that Houston ISD, we're going to talk about the ISDs, and no, we're not going to talk about just the abuse that suffers up in there like we normally do. We're going to talk about how they're going to install filtered water stations to reduce the risk of lead poisoning in students. So I guess it's good they're just saying it's the risk of lead poisoning, right?
Is this like because of some like recent finding of lead, or is this just a preventative measure?
I'll say this much, that it turns out that they said they examined over 250 school testing reports were created, and that lead was detected in at least one water tap at 84% of schools tested. So I hope that answers your question somewhat. I don't know if there's more than that, but the recent tests look pretty bad. I don't know what motivated the test. Probably the fact that this has become a growing concern, in many cities. So yeah, that's turns out that 1/3 of the schools currently throughout the district already have filtered stations installed. What an improvement, and I don't know about how it was when you were a kid. That was less time ago than I was a kid, but we didn't have filtered water. I mean, and there's part of me that's like, oh, let them be able to provide their own water, and the other part of me is like, wait a minute, they're trapped there. They need to be able to have good water, So it's one of those situations.
I think good water, better water is always a good thing, right? And in terms of, especially if it's like the schools, the kids, and things like that. But I also just wonder, because I think there's probably more people aware of this or curious and concerned about this after learning about the water in Flint, Michigan, that we've heard about for years, being filled with lead poisoning and kids getting it and finding the schools. And so I think it's overall a good thing. My guess is somebody's probably concerned about what may have been in the water. And yeah, I was drinking that faucet water when I was a kid, when I was younger. I don't drink from those faucets anymore these days. I haven't for a long time. I'm a little more careful about the water I drink. So filters are probably a good thing.
Yeah, as you see at that bottom sentence of what's on the page now, as of Wednesday, there are more 500 cases of pediatric lead poisoning in Houston, according to Hopkins. Hopkins happens to be the Harris County environmental scientist who's stressing that we actually have this problem to contend with. And I think, if you think of all the things, we're looking at the bonds, right? We just saw how they all passed. And we're looking at the things that they spend money on. I think at least, if you're going to force kids to go to school, making sure that they can be safe in terms of not being abused by authoritarians in there and all those things, as well as safe from, have safe water. It's not really that expensive, so I guess it's a good move. And I wonder about some of the more limited school districts that are here within Houston. Often we just say HISD, and people outside Houston don't realize that any of these metroplexes, we have Aldine's, the Cy-Fair, and the list just goes on. But yeah,
overall, probably a positive thing.
A little bit of a positive solution to a problem. Problem's not positive, but at least doing something about it is.
Well, speaking of water, Micah, this is a good, set follow-up for that with some positive results. But speaking of another toxin in the water, fluoride, I have this story here that I've been following for now 2 years. The lawsuit against this ongoing lawsuit, which really, it started 2 years ago, like actual hearings, but it was ongoing since 2016, because this is how things drag out when you're dealing with the U.S. government. And the basic story here is that Food and Water Watch, the Fluoride Action Network, Moms Against Fluoridation, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology, and the Organic Consumers Association have been dealing with the US EPA in this almost decades-long battle now, where they tried to get the EPA to regulate fluoride or to stop, the process of adding fluoride to the water supply in the US, based on what's called the Toxic Substances Abuse Act. And so that's been going on for a while now. In 2020, they finally were able to get it like, okay, there's going to be a trial they're going to be able to bring evidence and present experts, and the government's going to be able to do the same. And that went on for a while. There's a lot of really big things that came out of that. I covered that at the time. We probably, have those archives on our website. But in 2020, August 2020, the judge said it's going to go into abeyance. He basically stayed the trial. So it was paused until he was basically waiting for another study to come out, and said, okay, well, if this study is going to be coming out soon, let's just wait. Let me wait till that final, that this new study comes out, and I'll make my final ruling. Well, it's been 2 years now, and the study still hasn't come out. And so the Fluoride Action Network filed a new petition trying to ask the judge to move forward with the trial and to allow them to have like a second phase of their trial, and to go forward with what they have and get him to make his conclusions. And this was something the U.S. government, the EPA, their attorneys were fighting against and saying, we should continue to wait. And the judge said, look, we've been waiting for 2 years. This is Judge Edward Chin, federal judge in the U.S. And he said that I'm going to go forward one way or the other. He asked the attorneys for the Fluoride Action Network, the plaintiffs, if you can get access to this report. It's from the National Toxicology Program. They released a draft report in May, but they haven't made it public. And so the EPA is arguing, let's wait another year to see if they make it public. And the Fluoride Action Network attorneys are saying, no, look, we've got more than enough evidence. If I can get access to the draft, judge, will you consider it and then make a ruling? That's sort of where things are at. So the judge said, okay, we're going to go forward. He hasn't set a new date for a new trial or anything, but there's going to be another status hearing in January 10th, 2023. So overall, like a bunch of legal arguments taking place over about an hour. And the short, the even shorter version is it's a good thing. It's another positive story to add to your lead one, Micah, because this is one step closer in a long, slow legal process to potentially ending water fluoridation in the United States. If this lawsuit is successful and they do end up winning and the judge rules in their favor, the EPA would then be tasked with getting fluoride out of the water or regulating to some degree. It would change water fluoridation, which has been going on for 60, 70 years in the U.S. So
what it means is cities like Houston, if he against the federal regulation, probably for them to spend $4 million, every 4 years on in industrial waste products.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe that could go towards water filters for the school district, or I don't know, something.
Yeah, see right there. Maybe they're looking for the money for that to get the lead out of the water. They just stop adding fluoride and then use that money. And in Houston, it's $4 million. In most cities, it's millions of dollars. So yeah, I'm going to continue to follow that. Update will probably be the new year. Stay tuned for that. And then I got another story, just a brief update. I mentioned, Micah, because you touched on this, I think, on our show 2 weeks ago. And we've talked about it for a while now, because this is something that's potentially going to happen in Houston. It's already happened in Texas. It's already happened in Brazil. You covered that these genetically engineered mosquitoes are starting to be released in certain places. And there's a lot of people out there who I think have concerns about this, because mosquitoes are being talked about in multiple fronts these days. You've got the genetically engineered mosquitoes conversation. They're being released in Miami and Palm Beach area. They've been released in parts of Brazil. And then you've also got discussions about mosquitoes as vaccinators, and, Bill Gates and others funding mosquitoes and saying that potentially in the future, you might not need to go to the doctor. Mosquitoes that are carrying some quote unquote vaccine will bite you and then treat you. And there's articles about that. If you've never heard about it or seen that one out there, I encourage you to check it out. But anyways, this after your follow-up, Micah, which you did a couple of weeks ago, which was basically saying that they've started to release them in Brazil, and surprise, surprise, it's not working out the way they promised. The females don't want to mate with them. They're not dying right away like they claim, things like that. Well, now we have lawmakers in California objecting to these GE mosquitoes, saying there are, quote, too many unknown factors. One advocate is quoted by Common Dreams as saying people have not consented to being part of this open-air biopesticide experiment. It says here, as environmental advocates call on regulators to lead with sound science regarding the proposed release of thousands of genetically engineered mosquitoes on a weekly basis in Central California, 8 lawmakers on Thursday, this is about a week ago, demanded that officials reject the proposal without an in-depth review of its potential impacts. So biotech company Oxitec, which again is funded in large part by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and is the main company working to do this in Florida and elsewhere, they're trying to get California to be the second state following Florida and then potentially Texas soon to have an experimental release of these GE mosquitoes. And they've applied for a permit to conduct research with its product at 48 test sites in a county in Central California. This experimental release would target the mosquito species Aedes aegypti, which I think is the same one they use elsewhere, and aim to reduce its population. And it goes on to give some more details, but basically that says everything you need to know. There's some politicians out there speaking up. They wrote a letter, sent it in, and they've got some lawmakers signing on it. It says, quote, significant scientific research is still needed to understand the potential public health and environmental concerns associated with the release of this novel insect prior to any approval. It is our understanding that while the U.S. EPA did approve the GE mosquitoes to be released in California, the agency did not conduct a thorough scientific review of the impacts of this insect on the public health or the environment. California must require more and better information prior to any approval. So I don't think this conversation is going to be over by any means anytime soon. I think that, obviously now it's like Florida, it's California, and it's Texas, it's Brazil. This technology is being pushed out there for one reason or another, and maybe it's just a scientific approach and it just hasn't been perfected and it needs some time to get it right or whatever. But I don't know, it makes me uncomfortable. And especially after, before, Micah, when I was talking about it years ago, it was just like, hey, they're like the lawmakers were just saying there hasn't been a lot of studies based on the research I've done really proving that this is safe. And then now there's some real world examples of what's taking place in Brazil, which you were talking about before. So seems like there's reason enough to, ask for some caution.
Yeah, there ought to be some sort of accountability, responsibility to, at least if you're using like government or university type funds in this research, I don't know how far we can push that, but at the same time, I don't know. It's difficult because obviously the power to do this stuff is there. And so any law isn't really going to get in the way of stopping free people from genetically modifying organisms if they so are empowered to and inclined to. But with that being said, I think that a lot of things people believe, it seems like a lot of short-sighted stuff, right? Because we see these things like with the ones that were released in Brazil, and I'm just going from memory here, conversationally. Remember they had a little part that made them glow, so then they stood out from the other mosquitoes. But since it makes the female unable to have eggs again, I believe that's what it does. It becomes detrimental to the female, and so it's become like naturally selected out, and like the female mosquitoes don't want to mate with it there, and they stand out because they glow. And I guess somehow the mosquitoes are recognizing something about them. So maybe they stand out to the female mosquitoes also. It's kind of like a downgrade to get with one of these mosquitoes. And in addition to that, they thought they would die out, right? But they're living on, the glowing mosquitoes. So who knows where that goes?
Yeah, they've always claimed that they would mate and then they die. And so this story here, where I found this? I went to thehoustonfreethinkers.com and I looked at our archives and I found the link. Nice. But they've claimed that they're, like as you said, that they're going to die. That they're just their whole goal is like these mosquitoes are supposed to mate and then they're dead and then they don't exist. But that's clearly not happening. So I would keep an eye on this. If you live in California, Florida, Texas, or any of these places where they're discussing some of these types of experiments. Now let's move to another. This is our last little health story here. We're going to hit a couple of financial stories as we wrap up here in just a bit. This one, I think, is a good conversation starter, Mike. I posted this in my Telegram, and there's some interesting responses I'll share with you. But I'd like to get your thoughts, and anybody out there, if you're watching on Odyssey, Rockfin, you want to comment, we would love to share that comment with everybody else while we're watching. or YouTube, Facebook, etc. So Canada will soon allow medically assisted dying for mental illness. Has there been enough time to get it right? This is published in the Globe and Mail. With doctors divided and federal guidelines still in development, Canadians have questions about who will qualify for MAID next year and whether it's a good idea to give the most vulnerable an easy way to die. So this is a kind of a narrative article.
Seriously,
So
the acronym is MAID, like cleaning up the.
yeah.
Okay.
It's interesting. They go into describing some different stuff here, like just as an example of the kind of person that they believe this might benefit. It says that Julie LeBlanc, she's feeling hopeless. She's been struggling with mental illness since she was 8 years old. At 13, she was given her first antidepressants. Now at 31, she's tried too many medications to count, and she spent much of her life either in therapy or waiting on a list to receive it. Bounced between doctors, she's been given multiple diagnoses: depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder. She wavers between wanting to die and trying to live, especially for her 11-year-old son who is cared for by her parents. She tries to feel hopeful about the
Is
news.
this a Canadian citizen?
I think so.
They had this wonderful healthcare system thing. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
doctor doesn't sound pleasant.
Well, and I also think, we'll just avoid that because you could get into some discussion about whether those are even the appropriate tactics. I'm not here to tell anybody else what to do, but it goes on. She's having a hard life, basically, and she's tried taking her own life. I'm not trying to diminish that. I'm just trying to get to the meat here. She worries now about suicide being painful or ending up in a wheelchair, which happened to someone she knows. She has researched medical assistance in dying online. MAID sounds peaceful, she says, and too tempting. How can it be, she wonders, that the same system meant to keep her alive might soon help her die? And when this option arrives in March, Canada will have one of the most liberal euthanasia laws in the world, joining only a few countries in the world that allow assisted dying for mental illness. It will be the most controversial expansion of MAID since a Supreme Court ruling led the federal government to legalize euthanasia in 2016. At the time, MAID was only for patients with a foreseeable death. But Parliament, with Bill C-7, removed that requirement in 2021. This original version of the bill did not allow assisted death for patients with mental disorders as a sole condition because the government said at the time that there are outstanding questions about how mental illnesses such as depression could be included into this safely. And so, anyways, long story short, after some political back and forth, now mental illness is on the table. With 4 months to go, there is still no consensus in the mental health community, and in fact, doctors remain deeply divided. There are no finalized national standards, no transparent review process, and in place to watch for mistakes. And hospitals are still figuring out how they would implement the change. Toronto's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, Canada's largest psychiatric hospital, has said that assisted dying shouldn't expand without more hospital. And the Canadian Mental Health Association has also raised concern about expanding this without first increasing funding. And it goes on from there. But as you can imagine, this is fairly controversial and it's about to come into place in Canada. So just to ask the question from the headline, Micah, obviously neither of us are experts on this, but it's asking, like, has there been enough time for Canada to go forward with this? Do you think it's possible for there ever to be enough time, like, to say, like, okay, we're at a position where we can safely assist people in killing themselves without violating any, ethical boundaries or, making a mistake where somebody might have, improved their condition and decided not to die? I don't know. I mean, it brings up so many questions.
I think when you get into the ethical issue, we always have to make the distinction that there's multiple ethical systems, but also, in addition to that, there's multiple ethical questions here. Like, do you have the right to get in the way of someone who chooses to die? That's one question. And then I kind of think the whole thing about, mental disability being like a prerequisite or whatever, it sounds like, first off, I think it's kind of a prerequisite unless you're in so much pain. It's hard to put that on someone, but we'd like to think that they're mentally tortured to think that, often their life is better than to go on living. We like to think of that as a mentally troubled view. So then you got to ask yourself, so what's happening here? Will there be a situation where mentally depressed, mentally troubled individuals are more or less sold, made, and in exchange, what happens? I don't know. There could be all kinds of things that happen. A lot of money could change hands. And also a lot of relatives could be disgruntled later and say, wait a minute, they took advantage of my aunt who was depressed or my uncle who came back from the war and wasn't all right. And, and for thousands of dollars. I'm sure it's not a cheap medical procedure, because certainly getting rid of a body isn't even that cheap. They took my uncle away, and it sounds like potential lawsuits, if it's taken that route. But at the same time, I think it's weird to require or to make it like only certain subsets of people can have assisted suicide. To have any requirement for why you got to meet some kind of, other than being able to afford the bill, why do we have to have any approval as free people? Then there's the whole moral question, which people are going to have, different views based on their, worldviews and their ethical belief systems. I don't think that you can go to a government to get good ethical advice. Let's just put it that way.
I agree with that. So when I shared this earlier, Micah, this is the comment I share with it, that I believe people own themselves and they have a right to decide how they die. But I also believe, and for me, recognize that there's what I would consider to be a death cult trying to hijack this planet, and that maybe they want to promote the idea of encouraging more death, or just people not thinking so big about such a big decision. People have argued that same about abortion and things like that. And then when I shared the article
back in the day, and many things that people see is tied to depending on the view, were often moral decisions at the time.
Yeah, and I get that. So I'm not trying to make a value judgment on what other people are doing, but I do think it's worth considering. And there's some interesting comments that came on Telegram. I'll share a couple of them. Someone wrote, "All I know is that I have watched many people die within the system, and any type of comfort care, senior living, hospitalization, they all kill you. They don't honor your spirit. They will medicate you to death, and they rob these people of their right and their experience of death. I'd bet that this will just be the exact same thing, but with different words." And another person says, "When I listen to those who attempted suicide but lived, at least 90% are so glad that they are still with us. Many of them change their mind almost immediately." Someone else says, "Personally, as an advocate of self-governance, I don't have an issue with it in that we own ourselves, and therefore what we do with ourselves is ostensibly nobody's business but our own. I think this would have a virtually unlimited amount of unintended consequences, as others have pointed out. That said, watching my mother-in-law go through hospice care, I can't help but see a benefit to something like this as well. I certainly do not ever want to go through what she is going through, and there's no treatment, only comfort care in hospice," it says. And then one more here I'll say. Someone else says, I agree with your statement. We own our life and should be free to decide how to end it. But others are in no way obligated to assist me or make it easier for me. Personally, I have a preference toward preserving things that have value. Life is valuable, and as such, I would always default towards trying to assist with the continuation of that life rather than assisting with its end. There's also the aspect of this being a permanent decision. This should never be taken lightly."
And I think that last part you just said, it kind of ties in with something you were saying earlier, about other decisions that probably shouldn't be taken lightly, that are increasingly taken lightly. Not saying that there's a prescribed answer to any of these, whether we're talking about divorce, abortion, suicide. These are, I don't feel like anybody who's being honest would deny that these are, there's something similar about these questions, that they have a gravity.
We got the Erie Fairy as well, who's a longtime listener. Shout out to her on YouTube. I've always been torn about that one, because I feel like we don't have a right to stop someone, but also it can be used for people to commit homicide. And she continues, like for others to make it look like suicide, but it's not, which for those who might not understand that, there's definitely folks who believe and feel, and I think there's some evidence that their family members were potentially murdered or killed early in old folks' homes, retirement homes during COVID-19, where they were locked in place. And that's not even talking assisted suicide, but just the kind of things that can go on in these sort of facilities. So,
and that's the other thing to keep in mind, look at how this is happening. This is happening through the medical industrial complex. This is not just, hey, if you want to get buried on your property, if you want to go out into the mountain, if you want to go ride a canoe out, into the Pacific, it's not like, oh, it's the same thing like you're seeing with various things where it has to be systematic, all within the state, nothing outside. So this whole decision for suicides now will be you know, the government's becoming more liberal. It will now include, you know, suicide as an option. You know, it's a viable life form now. It's the increase on license for the people. We will now permit them in our graciousness to commit suicide through our medical industrial complex.
You have the permission to kill yourself for $1,000 a month for the rest of your life, which, you know, whatever. I don't know, man. It's interesting. And we have some Canadians who tuned in and commented. We appreciate your thoughts wherever you're at. And it's probably going to be something, consider, you know, something similar coming to a town near you if things continue in this
Comes
direction.
around that starts saying how you're carbon based and that you're just a pollutant and just like, you know, maybe there's the potentiality, you know, we look at things that have changed. Look at in your life things you never would have thought when you were a kid, this whole COVID mess. You never would have thought 9/11 before it happened and the effects afterwards. Who knows what kind of, you know, ideologies will be spun out because of the ability to do this easily. I don't know, but that's all I've really got to say about it. I did think that one article that I mentioned to you, Derrick, that I wasn't so sure if we needed to go deep in. I thought it was interesting. I didn't understand it all, but I thought the source of it was interesting also. Are you familiar with that name? Do you want to talk about this for a minute with me, or do you want to move on to finance?
We can cover it if you want. I'm not familiar with it. I mean, I know it's a Substack, right? I don't know who the writer was. I didn't get a good look at it.
I'll say this. I thought it seemed interesting. It was beyond my technical capacity, and having no concern for myself with it. I had heard some things about, you know, the vaccine. So I'd heard some things about these vaccines and such. So I saw this guy here. He's a doctor, and I looked him up, and it turns out that he's vice chief of internal medicine at Baylor, you know, and professor over at Texas A&M. And they yell now saying that he promoted misinformation about COVID, the COVID vaccine and treatments. So, you know, you got to take it with a grain of salt, I guess, if you believe what people call misinformation. And since my technical understanding of it is probably far beneath this medical doctors, I thought, whoa, what is this? You know, but it turns out that this is one of those arguments where people, this doctor is arguing that there's the potential for an unintended consequence of a novel COVID-19 vaccine. And, you know, we've seen different things. We've heard some concerns, and perhaps this one's far-fetched. Maybe that's why they say he sponsors misinformation. I don't know.
Well,
But
I do want to mention that I do know who this is. I didn't know this is the name of his Substack, but it's Dr. Peter McCullough, for those who are familiar with him. He's definitely one of the most credentialed cardiologists who's been speaking out about the shots for a while.
Definitely. And that was the thing to balance it with, is that so he's being accused of all this stuff, but, you know, in the meantime, you know, he's the founder and current president of the Cardio-Renal Society of America, editor-in-chief of the society's journal, you know, editor of journal reviews in cardiovascular medicine. So I don't know, you know, what to say. They say some of the public statements that he made that were misinformation were that he testified before a committee of the Texas Senate in 2021, and which he made false claims about COVID-19 vaccines, including that people under 50 years of age and survivors remember us talking about this, do not need the vaccine. So what's the misinformation? That we do not need the vaccine, and that there is no evidence of asymptomatic spread of COVID-19. So they're claiming that him saying that was, you know, misinformation. So, you know, I thought this was interesting.
Definitely not allowed to say that.
No, you're not allowed to talk about the vaccines. But I did think it was interesting here because it was one of the first times I'd heard any sort of explanation of, you know, people talked about this being, you know, some sort of genetically manipulative vaccine. I'd heard of it like in, I don't know, at night in the city on the streets. I don't know. Just it came through different channels coming in. You know, it was kind of like I always dismissed it because I was like, yeah, I don't care because I'm not going to get one of those. You know what I mean? But you know, I wondered about it. It was hurried through all that sort of stuff. We looked at what it meant, mRNA, but it turns out that he goes on that in this article, this doctor tells us that there was a doctor named Ralph Barrick in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has been publishing on coronaviruses since the 1990s. Basically, he tells us this to point out the fact that this isn't something new. Okay, it didn't just pop up in a lab out of nowhere in Wuhan or anywhere else. Even if it did, this version gets studied there. Barrick and his consortium, including Harvard and 2 Swiss lab conceived projects, wrote federal grants, once awarded, did their development work in the Wuhan Institute of Virology Biosecurity Annex Level 4. So, those are Swiss lab and Harvard educated people. The laboratory built by Stephanie Bankel, formerly at BioMaru and now CEO of Moderna and NIH partner in the mRNA patent. And the doctor says, I wonder, in all the DARPA and NIH meetings that occurred in the last 10 years on mRNA, did they ever consider reverse transcription? And this is the part this is where he's saying this is where it manipulates your DNA. If the mRNA stays long enough in the cystosol and is not dissolved by enzymes, the human cell would find base pairs of nucleic acids and create a mirror image of the genetic code, which could be brought into the nucleus of the cell for insertion into the human genome. This is such a giant consideration because genetic code for a damaging and lethal protein installed into our own cells permanently would be passed down to somatic daughter cells and from spermatocytes to oocytes and to an embryo. Forever changing the human genome for future generations must have been a large part of the safety discussions in those DARPA and NIH transcripts. Only investigation and release of the documents will tell the story. In the meantime, Alden et al. Have demonstrated integration of the Center 444 base pair amplicon. So there was a basically a lawsuit that's out to help break some of the information where they're trying to get that information, revealed in the lawsuit. So that
what's crazy though, Micah, is that people have been saying this for at least a year and a half. Dr. McCullough, he's talked about this in some other research, but others who've been pointing to like not only the patents that have happened in the past, looking into the mRNA, the companies studying this type of technology, specifically the technology used in the mRNA shot for COVID-19. I mean, that idea of that this is affecting your genetic code. You probably remember how hard the fact checkers were pushing back against that all of 2021. And as the shot started to roll out, people were some concerned doctors, including Robert Malone, Peter McCullough, and others, were talking about this and saying the potential for it to affect people down to the genetic level. And that's all been fact checked. That's all fake news, disinformation, et cetera, et cetera.
Well,
but here we are.
Yeah, for sure. And to the credit of all those slew in the army of fact checkers that couldn't stop, it turns out that Dr. McCullough says, and just bear with me a moment, he says, at this time, it is fair to say that reverse transcription of mRNA into the human genome is still theoretical. In other words, it's an idea of this is what could happen, right? But he argues it should be clear that more studies by independent laboratories need to be funded immediately because of this. The implications, given that massive numbers of recipients are simply too large to ignore this long-term safety concern. So the next time you see your doctor, ask him or her if they took an mRNA vaccine. When they say yes, ask them if they considered reverse transcription when the needle plunged into the arm. Did they say that they think they would be changed permanently? So, it turns out that Dr. McCullough and crew, because he's not alone. He's also works with the John Leake and other people. He is still, getting the ideas out there and questioning these things and working with other theories to speculate. And I don't, obviously he's not a vaccine expert, but that doesn't mean, he has ideas or his history or, anything like that make him some sort of person that you couldn't take these ideas in and see, okay, well, let's look. So yeah, I thought it was
definitely a lot
interesting.
still be gained from there, and I hope people will check that out. Check his Substack out. We'll put that link in the website as well. I got to get going just a moment, Micah, so we'll have to wrap this up. But we had a couple more stories. Maybe we can save them for next week so we can give them the time they deserve. I know you wanted to talk about FTX, and I had some positive stories about how the CBDCs rolling out, this digital currencies rolling out in some countries are not really being taken too kindly. People aren't really adopting or accepting them, at least not in the immediate. So maybe we'll save that for next week so we can give it the time it deserves. But appreciate everybody who's been here with us, all the comments. If you are following me on Facebook, on Derrick Broze or the Free Thinkers or Live Free Think Free, we're locked out of those pages for right now as far as streaming, but we're going to try to change that soon. In the meantime, we appreciate everybody on Odyssey, Rockfin, Facebook, YouTube, and everybody who will watch over on BitChute, on Hive, people who are going to listen to on Spotify. We appreciate you. Thank you guys so much for being here with us tonight. And we're going to get out of here. Anything else, Micah?
No, just the same thing you said. Appreciate everybody. Thank you, everybody, for setting fire, sharing it, and getting out there. Love doing this show. Always like talking about the stories. Love finding new music. So, if you're sitting on not sending us music, why?
Send us music.
Yeah.
Here's one we haven't played in a while. It's called Velveteen Echo. Check it out. We'll be back next week.